Welcome back to Vlad's ME Diary channel on YouTube or wherever else you're watching this. Let's have a tiny chat about illness and loss. So, in 30 seconds, I've had myalgic encephalomyelitis for let's not get ahead of ourselves, for about 22, 23 years. And I have had long COVID on top of that for about almost a year. And in the last month, I walked into a hospital last month or two with chest problems to do with the long COVID. And 3 weeks later, I left hospital, unable to walk or even sit in a wheelchair. So I have been delivered into a completely different body relative to where I was even a month ago. And now I can't stand at all. And I can't sit normally at all. And my window for doing this is tiny. I can't even whistle today. So let's talk a little bit about this, right? Because first of all, conversations about loss translate across different illnesses, and they even apply to non-illness situations that are hard. Now, the first thing to acknowledge when people are really ill is that there is a kind of risk of the loss of the sense of loss. A beautiful philosophy colleague once talked about that idea, that you're so screwed that you can't feel the thing you've lost because of losing something on top of that loss, which is the loss of the sense of loss. And when people feel very, very ill, they often simply do not have the resources to process both the suffering and the disability that they're encountering, especially if they are encountering it newly. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't really apply to people who are sort of veterans of chronic illness, people who've had ME for 35 years, surely they're going to be more on top of it. And the answer is yes, but ME is so volatile that even a 35-year-old veteran of ME is going to feel like they're in a kind of a new patch of the ocean with a different kind of storminess every few weeks, every few days sometimes. So it's not a completely static situation. It's always a sort of a cascade of symptoms, some of which are never fully intelligible. So that's very important, right? So let's just pick on me because I've given myself as an example. In the last few weeks, I have had so little time to process any of this that I don't have, I don't have periods where I am sort of in grief and in tears about what's happening to me, simply because I haven't had that bandwidth to process. That's one thing to say, that when you're suffering a lot physically, you often don't have the bandwidth to process the suffering until you're a bit better, ironically, if you're ever going to be a bit better. Let's get into this deeper now. I think losing something obviously accentuates your sense of that thing, because it's a thing that you've had, it's a thing that you love, it's a thing possibly you kind of depend on, and suddenly it's gone. That might be a little bit of work you were doing if you were well enough for that. That might be just the fact that you could move a little bit and now you can't. The fact that you had a certain modicum of, human connection which you now can't have. And so when something is gone, you have an intensified sense of that thing in your head. And I'm going to go somewhere quite demanding now. And that's that a question arises. Is there any way you can still give yourself the thing you have lost, even though you have lost it objectively? That's to say, it's not because of some kind of reason that's in your control that you've lost it. Let's say you can handle your illness better, but you're not doing that because you forgot to take your medication, or you stopped doing a treatment that was helping you, or you had some control over your mental health with meditation or with some kind of therapy you're doing online, and you've let go of that, and that's declined, and then your physical symptoms have declined because you stopped being disciplined around managing them. So let's say that nothing has changed that's in your control, and you've lost something big. We still have the question, how can you give this thing to yourself even though you've lost it? You might say, well, what the hell are you talking about? I can't go to drink my favorite bottle of wine to my favorite wine bar. How am I going to give myself that? I can't read a chapter of a book right now. How am I going to give myself that? This is nonsense. You've watched too much online self-help, and next you're going to tell us to grow muscles and go on a purely meat-eating diet, carnivore diet, which is, of course, this huge fad online, which I might talk about at some point, actually, because I'm to a degree qualified to discuss who it may or may not help, that kind of diet. But I think that there is a conversation here. It's not a conversation of literally giving yourself the thing you've lost. It's a conversation about seeing heaven from hell. I think there's a clip I saw of John Berger, the author and art commentator, who I think quoted Rilke, who had written to a friend saying, yes, you have lost this relative, but now your sense of them will be greater and more three-dimensional than ever before, something like that. It's very, very risky, this kind of talk, because it gets you into kitsch straight away. And kitsch is when you, in a saccharine way, underestimate the tragic element of life. But I do think there is something to that. And I think that where I learned some of it is my sense of the young Beethoven. It's absolutely clear, even if you know nothing about Beethoven's biography, you just need to listen to his first two piano concertos, that Beethoven, when he was healthy, already developed a capacity to, let's use a somewhat kitsch phrase, see heaven from hell, before he descended into hell with his health and with his deafness. Now, of course, he never descended into what I would call an ultimate hell. And an ultimate hell is when you can no longer compose as Beethoven. We'll come to that in a moment. This idea of what happens if you're sitting on a lot of talent and you can't use it. But Beethoven, except for stretches, never really had to face that kind of hell. And it's often the kind of a non-musical person's thought what a genius Beethoven must have been to compose while deaf, and actually, no, it's not that hard. Just like people say, oh my God, isn't it so hard to go on stage as a pianist and remember thousands upon thousands of notes? And no, it isn't. You can teach any 16-year-old to do that pretty much. Now, so Beethoven didn't reach the ultimate sort of depths of hell, but he experienced a lot of hell, and he had an extraordinary capacity which he failed to actualize in his personal life because he was reckless and abrupt and irresponsible. and hypocritical and enormously dysregulated. But in his output, he managed to generate an extraordinary kind of tenderness and a sense of access to things that he didn't actually have. He demonstrated in the music what it's like to have access to things you don't have. So how would we put this access business? Well, you could put it like this. You would love to go to the playground and play. Yes, but you can't. But you can hear the other kids playing in the playground, and you can see that the playground is part of the world, and that these kids are there, even though you're not, and they're enjoying it. So it's a fulfillment in life, not as a participant, but as a spectator. So a very important long-term way of dealing with loss, where you're physically prevented from doing certain things, is this question, which is always an exploration. It takes years. How do you get fulfilled by something as a spectator, even though you can't be fulfilled by it as a participant in it? There's nothing as good as participation. If somebody wants to tell you there's some kind of ultimately platonic sense in which being conscious of something, being in the world and feeling that you have a sense of access to it because you are in the world and it is in the world and you're aware that it's there, bullshit. The spectatorial connection is always more shit than the participatory connection. Ideally, you have both, right? But if you can't have the participatory connection, having the spectatorial connection is very important, right? There are certain kinds of, artistic expression in the world that I'm not able to engage with now, but I know that they're there, and maybe to a little extent I can engage with them in my head. So I hope I've made some sense about this seeing heaven from hell business by not making it too kitsch, but also not just dismissing it as something that's unobtainable. It is obtainable. Well, now let's talk about another scenario. And that's a scenario if you're sitting on either of two things: a very big responsibility to do something. Let's say you have an extraordinary sense of career clarity. It doesn't mean you're the best person in the world at what you do, but you just have an enormous sense of clarity and an enormous sense of your contribution, and you must do that well. You just must. It's who you are. And of course, you're too ill and you can't. Or alternatively, and of course you can have both, you have just a very big degree of talent. And so you're saying, well, this is an important thing for us to have in the world, as in it's important for humans to do that job, and it's important for humans who are very, very good at it to do it. I'm one of those. I'm one of the humans who's very good at this particular job, and so it'll be very good for the world if I could do it, but I can't. That second scenario is one, if you know me, that you know that I feel, especially about professional philosophy, that there are big holes out there. I can fill them easily. It'd be very culturally important if I filled them, but I can't fill them, except by going at sort of a millimeter a year. And my beautiful community on YouTube, on the other channels, on the main channel, and some of my work, a tiny bit of YouTube, has allowed me to be a public intellectual, a minor public intellectual, working an hour or two a day. Not now less. Even though I'm sick. And indeed, even in the last month, when my health has dramatically changed, I have still been doing a little bit of public intellectual work, particularly on the chat channel on YouTube. But the professional philosophy stuff is hard. Isaiah Berlin's editor and literary executive, the man who made Isaiah Berlin who he is, wrote me an email, a while ago asking, well, Vlad, slightly tongue-in-cheek, well, Vlad, when's your book coming? Because, I'm getting on and am I ever going to see it? And how do you cope with that? So now we've put this different predicament. You're not just stop from doing, what people do to lead a fulfilling life. You now stop from doing a particular activity to which you're tied via a deep sense of responsibility, which is the consciousness of a need for a contribution and consciousness of your talents in that direction. What do you do with that? This is an even more difficult thing than seeing heaven from hell. You keep exploring. Now, let me give you an absolutely idiotic example, but then I'm going to say that there is something in that direction that's actually ultimately real. So, I don't know, you're writing a novel. It's going to be, everybody's writing a novel today, but let's say your novel is culturally important. Boom, and you're cut off quarter of the way through by an illness from which it doesn't look like you'll recover. But it's a chronic illness, so it won't take your life in the short term. So you figure out how to fulfill all of your needs in bed and create the biggest window you possibly can for working. You realize you can't write. So you begin to dictate, if you're in the 19th century to somebody, if you're today to Evernote or something. And then your dictation is transcribed. And so you've done a little something. But if you went about it the old way, if you tried to sit at the desk, you tried to type, you couldn't do it. Now, what if you can't dictate? Something else. You think of something, some other second best, and you explore. Now, let's take a very famous example. Nietzsche wrote aphoristically because he was too ill to write full length. Now, he convinced himself that was better anyway for his philosophical output. You don't have to believe him. He believed himself. You don't have to believe him. But clearly, illness radically transformed his stylistic output. He adjusted to it and became, one of the 5 greatest moral philosophers of all time. What if you don't even have time to think? You don't have the space to think. You're too ill to think. Explore how you might create it. It takes about 10-15 minutes to think in a sustained way normally. You have to get into a certain state if you're going to think imaginatively and creatively. Is there any way you can try to replicate that in 20-second slots? It's impossible, surely. But is it completely impossible? Right? So what I'm trying to say here is this is hard, and this is like squeezing, water from a stone. But it's not quite that. And the principle is, even though there are definite physical limits that your illness puts in place, what is possible to do within them is always a matter of exploration, right? Now, you're not going to explore whether you can run the marathon tomorrow if you can't stand, of course. But there's always the possibility to explore that maybe you can do more without the physical limits shifting. There's always the possibility to come up with a solution that nobody's come up with before, or that you haven't heard of before, that somehow helps you be a little bit more productive. That requires boldness, it requires confidence, it requires assertiveness, asking things from people around you to facilitate that. It requires these people loving you, of course. And it also requires not being off oxygen for 20 minutes, which is nearly my limit at the moment. So let's try to finish this off really quickly. Physical limits are real. They might be relatively fixed, right? But what's possible to do within these limits is a matter of exploration, and every 6 months an aim should be to create a little loophole, to create a little bit of pliancy that sort of softens the boundaries of the physically and the practically impossible for you, even though your illness debilitation level remains the same. So for me, I'll be honest, I pretty much can't do philosophy now. But even though I can't, every day I'm still waking up with the question, can I do it? And the answer is, I don't know, but maybe there's a tiny something. Final remark. You need love. And the kind of love you need has 2 ingredients. It obviously needs to carry you and hold you, but it also needs to be a kind of love that contextualizes you. Because one of the worst things you can do, you can receive, that's not one of the worst, it's better than nothing, but not an ideal thing you can receive, is a love that basically just sort of coddles you and centers the terrible things that have happened to you without putting them in the human context. As Nietzsche would say, without putting them in the context that for every Raphael, there are 500 Raphaels born without hands. And what you need from somebody who loves you in order to feel safe and in order to feel grounded and in order to feel like you're living your life and not just waiting to live your life, right? Because when you're disabled, you can't do anything, you're still living. This is not cessation. It feels like cessation, but it shouldn't quite. It's a life in which life has not given you any of the things you want to have in order to live. Life has given you something you didn't ask for. But the love you get needs to be a love that says you're loved and what you're going through is tragic beyond words. But it also needs to be a love that is clear-sighted and balances closeness with distance in the healthy sense that it says, look, there are other humans who are disabled and going through uniquely brutal and contingent events in their life. You're among that community of humans. And that community of humans is there because there's a human potential for everybody to end up in that place. So you're going through a lot and you're held, and what you're going through is awful and tragic and beyond words, and I love you and I can barely bear it. But, because I love you, but there's also the prosaic picture that what's happening to you is part of the human predicament. A human predicament in which there's a potential for illness and disability in everyone, and a reality in some that it happens to them and it's life-altering. So, I love you, I love you, I love you, soft, gentle, being held, but also there is a planet. On the planet live some clever animals, and these clever animals get sick, and you're one of the ones that's got sick. Unless you also have that aspect of love, you're going to feel extremely ungrounded and more traumatized, actually, by your illness. So that kind of contextualizing love de-traumatizes you or prevents the trauma, because you understand that you're in a world in which the kind of thing that's happened to you happens to people. So that's the kind of love you need. It needs to have both. Enough. Thank you for being with me. And of course, if you're going through things in these waters, my gentlest wishes to your body and to your mind. Bye-bye.